There you go. This is John Kane, and welcome to Let's Talk. Hey, I got a guest joining me today. I've got Leon Su, who will be here shortly. If you recall, he's been a guest in the past. He is the Foreign Affairs Minister for the Hawaiian Kingdom, and we're going to catch up on all things Hawaii today, and even talk about how some of this stuff, reaches beyond, just like as I talk about Native issues and I talk about a Native perspective on the issues that affect us all. Well, we're going to delve into a little bit of that as well. Before I get started, and I'm waiting on, I know Leon's traveling across town. He's been hanging out at the UN for a couple of days, so I'm sure he's making his way down here as we speak. I was telling Reggie before the show started, I asked him, I said, do you know where the Kansas City team actually gets its name from? And he says, do tell. Well, it turns out, and you can find this in an article on Indian Country Today. Vince Schilling, I think, is the one who did the piece. In fact, if you just look up the mayor of Kansas City, his name was Harold Bartle, B-A-R-T-L-E. If you look up his name, however it shows up, whether it's Wikipedia or wherever, you're going to find that he is attributed to convincing Lamar Hunt to bringing the what was the Dallas Texans to Kansas City. And once he convinced them to do that, they're looking for a name. Well, it turns out this Bartle or whatever he called himself was big in the Boy Scouts, and of course the Boy Scouts has always been tied into playing Indian, and so this Harold Bartle basically called himself and was called, or his nickname was the Chief. So it turns out the Kansas City Chiefs has nothing to do with Native people. It has to do with the mayor of Kansas City at the time being nicknamed the Chief. So it's like an appropriation times two. First, you got this white guy and he would literally put on a headdress and pose for pictures calling himself the Chief. They named the team after him, not after any real Native people. Now, that's not to say that any of the mascot stuff, none of it's real. I mean, it's all made up stuff anyway. But this is, you do a little bit of research and you find out that, for all of the tomahawk chopping and all these people, with war paint and playing Indian in the fans and all that other stuff, it's all crap. I mean, and as I mentioned last week, it's almost compounded when you consider that you got this appropriation of a Native culture so displaced, so misplaced in the Kansas City Chiefs, playing a team called the 49ers, which are the people who are associated with by even Gavin Newsom. And I misspoke this a little bit. I talked about how Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, had praised the gold rush, and he had. But he later came back and admitted that the gold rush resulted in the California genocide. He calls it that. He says there's no other word to describe what happened in California other than to call it what it is, a genocide. So, so you've got a team that's named after the causation for the California genocide against Native people, playing against a team with a namesake and mimicry and mockery of all things Native. That's named after a team that's not even, look, I hope I'm not boring for any of you who just have already been so fed up with this whole idea of football, especially after the Colin Kaepernick stuff and everything else. But I just think the mascot issue needs to be exposed on every occasion. Hey, look, on Tuesday back home, I do a show. Tuesdays and Saturday I do a show called Let's Talk Native, and on Tuesday I had to essentially commemorate, I guess, or at least acknowledge that on Monday, the previous day, was the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Now, that effectively, was the end of the Holocaust. What many people call the Jewish Holocaust, but obviously there were other people besides Jewish people who were murdered and tortured and again killed in mass, buried in mass graves, the whole bit. But essentially, when the Russians, and keep in mind, this is the Russians that did this. The United States, all the great white guys of Europe, no, they didn't do it. It was Russia that liberated Auschwitz. Just to remind people, and I'm not saying this to praise the Russians. I'm just, it is what it is. But
stating history. That's all you're doing.
Yeah. And so the question that I have is, when does the American genocide end? I mean, 1492 to when? Even if you want to claim that it ended, if you want to say, well, it ended with the massacre at Wounded Knee, really? So you're going to say it went from 1492 to 1890? Well, the problem is you still got mass murders taking place in places like the Osage murders in 1920. You still have, Native people being killed with indiscriminately, even though it might be illegal. I mean, they may not be paying for bounties anymore going through the 20th century, but there's still no prosecution. You could still kill a Native person and get away with it. You could still, rape a Native woman and get away with it. And in fact, you still can. And that's true in Canada. It's true in the United States. We still have a missing and murdered Indigenous women problem. And it's not just women. It's kind of like Black Lives Matter, isn't just about black people. It's just saying that they matter too. Well, when we say missing and murdered Indigenous women, we're including girls, we're including young boys, we're including men. We're talking about people who are just made missing and oftentimes murdered, oftentimes disappeared, as they call it. And that's still a problem. We've got, Native people in most demographics, in most age demographics, lead as a percentage of our population death by cop. Yeah, I know that's a shock to many people. They say, oh yeah, black people are killed at a higher rate than white people. Yes, they are. But you know what? Native people are killed at a higher rate yet. Except for in that, I think the 17 to 22 or something like that demographic. There's that one age group that they get eked out of the top spot. Oh, congratulations. But there's so much, and of course, the other thing that I have to reemphasize is that genocide isn't just about killing people. Genocide is about creating the conditions by which a people cease to exist as a distinct people. So the whole idea, what they used to call denationalization before the word genocide was even coined, was this notion that to strip away somebody's national character or cultural character, their identity, and then impose another national character or another identity upon them. The international community in 1919 called it a war crime. 1919. 5 years later, the United States would pass the Indian Citizenship Act and just boom, declare all Native people are citizens. No, we don't go for that. So the United States would literally commit the very thing that was only recently established as a war crime 5 years after this thing was, made public in the international community. And of course, the international community would adopt the word genocide to replace essentially the word denationalization, because that started to have a different meaning. So they use the word genocide, which isn't it isn't just about killing people. Ethnic cleansing isn't just about killing people. It's about making people cease to exist as the people they once were. It includes killing people, but it also does things like sterilization. Where have I heard that? United States. Not just in residential schools, but in 1970, they created a program that coerced Native women in particular to become, to have the tubes tied. They don't like use the word sterilized, but that's what it was. 1970. This is how recent some of this stuff is. And how do we know this? Well, a lot of it got exposed when when Native people, including AIM, took over the BIA and they uncovered some of these documents. But yeah, this was a real thing. So ending somebody's reproductive, targeting a people for ending a reproduction of those people is part of genocide. Residential schools, which is something that I talk quite a bit about, and in fact, the film I'm doing tonight, for those of you who have the chance to come out, I'm doing a film downstairs at the Brooklyn Commons, 388 Atlantic Avenue. I know Reggie and others have been playing the cart for this film. It's a pretty powerful film, and it talks about the residential schools. This is genocide. It's forced assimilation, but assimilation, the idea of making a people cease to exist as a distinct people, is by definition, international definition, genocide. It just is. So the question I have is, when does it end? Because it hasn't ended. Because every single day, Native people, and sometimes it's our own people that are promoting this assimilation. Just get along. I posted a meme, I don't know, maybe I did it today or yesterday. I said, decolonization isn't about making the systems of oppression more comfortable. It's about dismantling them. I mean, untangling ourselves from it. It's about, I mean, look, and it's going to be an interesting conversation with Leon, because I know he gets tied into a lot of these conversations from back home too. But, you know, we got two things going on this year: the census and the election, the U.S. election and the U.S. census. From a Native standpoint, I don't participate in either, because for one thing, the United States is not my country. The land is my homeland. But I'm Mohawk. I live in Seneca territory. So where I live and the people that I have direct involvement are the Senecas. And of course, when I go back home to Mohawk territory, I mean, so that's who I am. So I don't consider myself a U.S. citizen. So why would I vote in their elections? And I don't think those folks who are elected represent me. Donald Trump, it isn't just cliche for me to say he's not my president. No, he isn't my president. Chuck Schumer, not my senator. You know, I don't have congressmen. None of those people have jurisdiction or representative responsibilities to the place that I live. You know, so and because they associate it with place, not only do they not represent the place that I live, but they don't represent the people that I'm associated with. So they're not my representative. So while I'm not telling people not to go out and vote, I'm just saying from a Native perspective, we don't represent a large enough voting bloc to have impact anyway. And it's not a concession that I would advocate. I'm not going to say, you know what, I know it's not our system, but let's just vote anyway. What's that other meme I put out there, Reggie? With the Star Wars guys, they say, okay, so we're all in agreement. We're going to join the empire and fix it from within, said no rebel ever. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. But you think you're going to, a few people who are already feeling like they're somewhat powerless are going to join the United States and fix it? I mean, it's like these folks say, oh, what we need is a Native American president. For one thing, who's we? Who is this we you're talking about? I mean, are these white people who are saying what you need is one of our people to be one of your people? Well, you've already got a bunch of that. In fact, you've had a bunch of them in Congress, not Republicans and Democrats. And in fact, I say it all the time. There was a Native person who was the vice president of the United States under Herbert Hoover, Charles Curtis. The heartbeat away from the presidency. And he was Native. And he sucked for Native people. So, yeah, maybe that's what you think you need, but that's not what I need. What I'd like to see is some strong, dedicated Native leadership. I don't mean authoritarian leaders. I mean people who lead by example, who will represent a free and independent people, not an assimilated people. Again, I listen to people all over. Native territories say, oh, yeah, we should have vote for this one, vote for Amy Klobuchar, vote for Heidi Heitkamp, vote for, Barack Obama. Look, none of these people did us any favors. Why? It's easy. They're not ours. They aren't our leaders. We aren't their priority. We are, in fact, we barely scratch the surface when it comes to their, their platform, their agenda. Look, I'm not saying that as I look at American politics that there aren't politicians that I would prefer over others. But make no mistake about it, none of them are going to represent my concerns. I think some of them are more diametrically opposed or stand in direct opposition to the things that I'm concerned about, some less than others. But I don't have to play that game about voting for the lesser of two evils. Why? Because not my president, whoever it is. Not my president. And as far as the census goes, this is another area where people say, well, if you don't stand up and be counted, then you can lose resources. For one thing, from a Native standpoint, let me be clear. The U.S. Census should not be the metric for measuring the obligations that the United States has towards Native people. I realize that they've turned around and they've reduced, their commitments on health care and education and all kinds of other things to their social benefit system. They aren't looking at it as a quote unquote treaty obligation or a promise made. They just lump it into social services. So people look at Native people as, they're just a bunch of welfare recipients. Well, no. I mean, I realize that's the box they put it in, but make no mistake about it. Whether we get health care or not somewhat subsidized by the Indian Health Services. That's not out of the kindness of somebody's heart. And whether we participate in the census, I mean, to be clear, what's the purpose of the census? The census has two functions. Well, one function, apportionment. Apportionment of what? Two things, money and representation. Well, if Congress doesn't represent us, then why should our numbers count in your census? And and if the federal government or state government want to know how many of us there are, ask our governments. They know. You don't need to come to our house. I don't need you, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons. I don't need any of you knocking on my door, because you're all trying to do the same thing as far as I'm concerned. You're trying to get me to join the club. Ain't happening. So now, having said that, in fact, I had a friend of mine ask, well, how do you feel about Native people who don't live on Native territory? And as I've said before on this show, I have a little bit different opinion about that, because if you live here in New York City, I think participating in your local governing structure that affects your neighborhood, I get that. Of course, the problem is you do have to declare that you're a U.S. citizen to do that, or in doing so, you're acknowledging or accepting or acquiescing to that imposition of U.S. citizenship. That's the problem. But in terms of the other effect, I mean, look, being counted in the census, it could affect whether where you live loses a congressional representative. It could affect dollars that flow into the community, to the non-native community. Now I'm not talking about if you're native and you live in New York City or someplace else. Look, you could step up. But here's what else you could do. You don't have to vote. You could encourage people who may not otherwise vote. Encourage them to vote. Encourage Americans to vote, and maybe give them a little bit of your native insight to say, you know what, you shouldn't vote for this guy, and here's why. And utilize your own diplomatic skill set to affect. I'm not saying people shouldn't vote. I will say that on the last election, I called for voter boycott, because I think there should have been a clear message about voter confidence based on the candidates that ran. Because either way, I thought that it was, frankly, I know people can sit there and say, well, Hillary would have been better than Trump. Well, I guess we'll never know. We will never know. we will never know. But the fact of the matter is, neither one. Hillary Clinton, she won the popular vote, but she didn't win the majority. Over 70 million people didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. 90 million didn't vote for anybody. 90 million eligible voters said, nah, I'll pass. But of the, what would it be, 140 million people, I guess, or just under 140 million people. Most of that 140 people didn't vote for either Trump or Clinton. 10 million people voted for a third-party candidate. 65 voted for Clinton, and 62 voted for Trump. The
largest overwhelming party in this entire country right now is non-voters.
Yeah. Yep.
Overwhelming.
And yet it's a two-party system that doesn't include them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, it's pretty frightening. I mean, and I don't know what's going to happen this year, but again, two things that are happening. The census and the election, and look, we're watching this crazy thing called the impeachment hearings that are going on. I mean, did I hear right? Did Alan Dershowitz literally say that Trump can do a quid pro quo? He can actually break law, or it's not a law if he has somebody help him win the next election, because as long as he believes that winning is in the national interest, which I'm not even sure that he believes that. I'm not sure that Donald Trump believes that he's the best president. He says it, but I mean, I gotta think when that clown looks in the mirror, he's gotta think, man, am I pulling off a big win here? Man, have I got a con job going here? I mean, he hasn't. I mean, he and his family and all the people around him, I'm sorry, all you people, all you gatekeepers who suck at it, that he's terrible. And that is not in the, all you Republicans lined up behind this clown because you're afraid you're going to lose your base. You know what a disaster this guy is. And, anyway, but I digress. But I do have, like I said, I do have my friend Leon Su, who is the Foreign Affairs Minister of the Hawaiian Kingdom. He is in town, and he's been traveling. He's been to Geneva. He's been at the UN. Been doing a bunch of work. Part of what his mission is trying to communicate the facts regarding the illegal overthrow or undermining or whatever, the illegal occupation of Hawaii, but also the undermining and the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And the fact is that most countries in the world still had diplomatic relationships, at least at the time, with the Hawaiian Kingdom. And they failed in their international obligation to step up to the United States when they pulled off what they pulled off. So, speaking of the United Nations, it was only about, I just saw my video had resurfaced of when I spoke at the UN in August a couple of years ago. And it's funny because it'll relate a little bit to Leon's visit here. I had gone to the United Nations talking about genocide because when you looked at the definition of genocide, as I spoke earlier, about this whole notion of denationalization and stripping away somebody's national character, one of the ways that you do that is by failing to recognize the right of a people to identify themselves. And among forms of identification are passports. And the fact of the matter is the United States and Canada literally attempt to prohibit Native people from traveling not only between the United States and Canada, which they do attempt to do that, but even traveling to other countries. So whether it's to play in an international sport or to travel, to Geneva or to do any of these environmental stuff, if we don't carry a U.S. passport, which means declare ourselves as U.S. citizens, if we try to maintain our own distinction, we're prohibited from traveling. Even though there's a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there's been this call for denationalization and genocide being a war crime. So I pitched that. I put that out there at the United Nations. It says, how is the failure of the international community to recognize our right to create our own travel documents not a war crime? How does it not fit in with the definition? If the only choice we have is to declare ourselves as U.S. or Canadian citizens to travel, how is that not by definition? I realize it's not killing us and burying us in mass graves, but it is killing our identities and burying them in mass graves, because this is what the whole goal. I mean, I was talking to Reggie earlier. I said, I'm going to revisit conversations on the doctrine of discovery, because I don't think there's a strong enough emphasis put on the fact that the doctrine of discovery was the foundation for slavery and for genocide. And the legacy left over from the doctrine of discovery is the land that has been stripped away, and the fact that you have all brown people of Latin America, predominantly are Catholics. Many black people are Baptists or some other denomination of Christianity. And same with Native people. I mean, so the legacy of conversion into believers, that's the assimilation. So not only do you have slavery, genocide, land theft, removal, assimilation, both politically, culturally, but even quote unquote spiritually, that's the legacy of the doctrine of discovery. So I'm gonna start spending a little bit more time, fleshing that out so we can have a bigger conversation that isn't just looked at as a native thing, but also when you talk about, so if that's the legacy, what's the solution? I know from a native standpoint, one of the things that Newcomb and other people put out there is that Native people represented a free and independent people prior to European contact. And if the doctrine of Christian discovery was the means to end that, And we know that it's a fraudulent doctrine. We know that it's been repudiated by many denominations, and at least on paper, and by the international community, according to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Then what's the solution? Why is it so impossible to accept that Native people can once again, and this includes Hawaii, be recognized as a free and independent people, free of the colonialization of, that is, fed by the doctrine of discovery? That's the question. All right, hey, we're at the bottom of the hour. We'll take a break here. We'll go to a song, and then we'll come back. Hopefully, Leon will be along shortly, and we'll get into some of the Hawaiian stuff. But we still got plenty to talk about, so we'll be back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk. All right, I haven't. Still haven't heard back in from Leon, but I'm sure he's coming. We got a 2-hour show, so we got plenty of time. A couple things. So yesterday was the anniversary, and you can look it up, Reggie. One of the massacres. I think it was called the Beaver Creek massacre, and this one took place in what is now known as Idaho, in an area. It's in like near Franklin, or the southern part, not far from the Utah border, and it was this massacre built up from hanging a young boy they claim stole a horse, because if you're a Native person, you could be hanged for just even the most minor crimes, and certainly without a trial. So they hang this guy, and it turns out this young man was the son of a chief, and so things went back and forth, and it culminates in a massacre of over. The military says it was only they killed only 200 men, women, and children, but most accounts, especially even from the non-native settlers in the area, they say that it was a massacre of over 400. This might be among the largest massacres, and one of the least known massacres. Now, and again, I think it's important to sometimes put these things in perspective. So this was essentially a month after the execution at Mankato, Minnesota. So you know how I talk about Abraham Lincoln signs the execution order to execute 38 Dakota in Mankato, Minnesota. A week later, he does the Emancipation Proclamation, liberating the slaves in the South, supposedly as a slave revolt. Doesn't liberate the ones in the North, by the way, but. And then a couple of weeks after that is this massacre. So when I ask that question, what is the date? When do we? I would argue we haven't reached the end date to the American genocide, because assimilation is still genocide. But if you want to call, there's a difference between what is established as the Holocaust and genocide. So if you want to, I guess you could attribute. Like I said, the Wounded Knee Massacre as the last mass massacre, at least orchestrated by the government and the military. There's been mass killings. Again, the Osage murders. I talk about that in the 1920s, because even though there is a conviction, a prosecution, and a guy goes to jail for killing several Osage people, they never look at the totality, and again, you can find this in David Grann's book, Killers of the Flower Moon. There may have been hundreds, if not over 1,000 Osage that were murdered for their oil revenue in Oklahoma. And they didn't want to look at it as a larger cultural conspiracy. They wanted to reduce it down to a one or two people involved in a serial killing. And so that's what they convicted a couple of people. And they say, case solved. We fixed it. It's all better now. We can go, nothing to see here, until you find out that there was plenty to see there, that it was a massive cover-up, not just by the FBI, but just by the white citizenry at large. So again, I asked the question, when does the genocide end? And we can, like I said, we can. They oftentimes refer to the Wounded Knee Massacre as the bookend. That was the final chapter in Native in Native massacres. Well, the problem is, the massacres may have ended, but assimilation, I mean, in 1890, it was in full swing. Like I said, we get into the 1970s, and that's when they formalize a way to start sterilizing people. The residential schools, some of the mortality rate for kids in these residential schools at certain periods of time was as high as 50%. 50%. And and we talk about the prison population. In some areas of Canada, the native percentage of prison inmates is 90% of the prison population. I mean, overall, it's still like 20%, even though they represent only 5% of the population. But in some areas, 90% of the prison population are native. So why is that? Because Canada doesn't have many black people. Yeah, you can't fill those prisons with black people. You gotta find some people as close as they can. No,
so this is diversity. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. I'm sorry, that was a cheap shot. I'm not gonna stereotype. I'm not gonna stereotype black people about not liking cold in Canada and everything else. There's plenty that do, but again, 5% of the population are Native people in Canada, and yet even in women's prisons, some of those prisons of population have 30, 40, 50% Native women. So if you're white, you almost get to this place where you've got to think, well, there must be something racial there. How else could that possibly be? How else could you, that's Leon. Yeah. How else could you possibly explain it? Because you don't want to say racism. You don't want to say that. No, not at all. Not at all. All right. Well, it does look like looks like my friend Leon has made it. I know traveling around the city is a bit of a challenge sometimes. So that's a bit of a challenge. So. Give me a few seconds as we get ourselves adjusted here. I know. I'm looking forward to this. We got a lot to talk about. You're standing right in front of the camera, by the way.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Leo. Grab a seat here. Let me introduce again, friend of the show, Ben on. Wow, this has got to at least beat your fourth or fifth time.
At least the third.
Yeah. I know we've had you several times. We don't really need the headphones until we start taking calls. So for now, you can just.
Okay.
But thanks. A little bit of help here. I know sometimes traveling from Manhattan and it can be a bit of a challenge. Pull the microphone; it's fully adjustable. Get it up there as close as you can. We do have a camera right there. You don't have to smile for the camera, but just know that it's there. Right. We are streaming the show live. I've got Kayulani Mahuka wanted me to send you her love.
Oh my God, very good.
I was on her show last week. I was on Songs of Sovereignty. So we stay connected too. So.
Very good. Well, she's wonderful because she keeps up the action there in Hawaii as well.
Well, she's tough.
She's on top of it. Yeah,
she's tough. I mean, and not just her. I mean, some of the folks that she's involved with. All right. I know there's a lot we can cover here, and I do want to hit not only the work that you're doing for the Hawaiian Kingdom, but obviously there. Reggie and I were just talking earlier that it almost seems like the tide is turning on the whole Mauna Kea stuff.
Very much so.
And I think there is a sense of defeatism coming across the 30-meter telescope folks. I think.
Yes, right.
So we can talk about that. FedRec is also another issue I want to talk about.
Okay.
But I also reached out to you a couple of months ago because I got into a bit of debate with some friends, of yours and mine about voting. And look, I think people participating in democracy is important, but for Native people, and I'm including Hawaiian people in this mix, for those of us who are not necessarily signing up for that, I mean, and we don't want to concede to having U.S. citizenship imposed upon us. We get into a funny debate because many of our people think, well, yeah, but if you don't vote, you don't have a say, and you don't do this. And I actually literally had somebody say, well, those guys who are fighting for the Hawaiian Kingdom are voting. I says, I don't know. So I reached out to you, and you flat out said, no, it's been. You might have voted in like the 70s or something like that. You said?
I think it was early 90s was the last time I voted.
But you clearly have drawn a line in the sand and said, no, I'm a Hawaiian. I'm not an American.
Right. Yeah. When I realized that in order to vote in a U.S. election, you have to actually declare you're a U.S. citizen. So in the 1990s, many of us said, wait a minute, that is awkward for us, to say the least, because on the one hand, we're saying we're not U.S. citizens. On the other hand, we're declaring that we are by signing up to vote and voting for and signing up for all the other baggage that comes with being a U.S. citizen.
Well, and it's not just what you do as an individual; it's what you're saying about where you live. This is an issue that oftentimes the way land is titled, I guess, it's ambiguous. But for where I live on the Seneca Nation territory of Cattaraugus. And the Seneca Nation, they regard their land as not part of the United States. And why? Well, because one thing, the Treaty of Canandaigua says the United States acknowledges that the land is the Senecas, and the United States will never claim the same, nor disturb them in the free use and enjoyment of their land. So, I mean, that's George Washington's administration that signs that into law. So if we take the position, as do many of the folks that you're involved working with, that the land is not part of the United States. If you register to vote, you are registering your address as within
the United States, and
not just within the United States. You're registering it as part of the state.
Yes,
so
that's correct.
You're even validating the fake state thing, right? Because the states manage elections. So you're going to put down your address as in a not only under state jurisdiction, but within state-defined congressional districts.
That's correct. And so one of the exercises that I go through every election cycle is I go down to register I pull out a registration document, and I fill out. So there are 3 questions that he asks. One is, are you a United States citizen? So I put no. I'm a Hawaiian subject. 2, what is your social security number? And I put none. And then 3, are you a resident of the state of Hawaii? And I put no, resident of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And I send that in, and of course I get rejected, which is the object of it. I want them to agree with me that I'm not them. Right.
It's important to get them to officially determine that if that's your position, that you don't have the right to vote in the United
States. That's correct. And that I'm not obligated to all the other things having to do with citizenship.
Interesting because, one of the things that international communities have tried to do is to insist that indigenous people have to be included. But it's that inclusion, even the word indigenous, which which I sometimes have a problem with. I understand what is intended by having a word like indigenous, but the definition of indigenous within the international community is based on living in an occupied state.
Correct.
Essentially. Yeah. I mean, they're defining you not as a people who pre-existed the colonialism, but they're as descendants of them. So they're not even acknowledging that we're those people. We're saying, no, you're descended from those people.
Well, that's why I like to use the term original. Original peoples.
Well, and I use, I use the word native, but even that's been, you guys, capital N versus small n in Hawaii, that makes a difference?
Because we get tied up into the U.S.'s definitions, and things like that. And so it's awkward. However, we're reclaiming who we are, and we're going to use the words redefine the words that we are using for ourselves.
Well, and of course, the easiest thing is to use the language. But at some point, when you're reaching out to people who don't speak the language, I mean, words like Ganaka Maoli have a specific meaning that captures some of it, but if people don't know what that means, then you got to try to find it. In my language, we have a word called ungwe, which means a real human being.
The real human being. That's the same thing as Kanaka Maoli.
And because for us to be real, you have to have a legacy tied to the land that you live on. And that's the difference between somebody who has been either transplanted willingly or unwillingly, that they don't have that. So without having that connection, I mean, we do a thing when we gather, we call it the Ohunda Guriwa Dekwa, and it means the words we say before all else. And what we do is we go from first we talk about the people have gathered, and we acknowledge our relationships. Then we talk about the relationship to the ground,
Yes.
the water,
Yes.
the plants, the animals, the fish, all the
And the
wildlife,
Creator.
everything,
Yeah.
everything, all of creation.
Yes.
But I will say, without getting into personifying the power of creation, still acknowledging the power of creation, but more importantly, acknowledging what the power of creation has presented to us. And because that is what's obvious.
Yes.
What's obvious is that it's here. I mean, even if we're talking about the stars, and the problem is, I know you guys run into this a lot in Hawaii, because as Native people, we have a whole lot of New Agers who just love, I love your culture, I love your spirituality, and they almost kind of turn it into like a Disney version of who we are,
right?
And so they come
Right.
up with, they don't understand, even as we use metaphors or stories or legends. It's, oh yeah, you people, you believe in this. No, for one thing, don't do the you people thing, and don't tell me what I believe in, because you just misunderstood either what I just told you, or you have a misunderstanding about. We have a creation story, but our creation story is a metaphor. It's actually a metaphor for childbirth. We talk about coming through and being born of water and that and all of that stuff. I mean, it's so, but I've heard people say, well, that means the Native people had a better understanding of wormholes and they try to do string theory and
Yes.
no, let's not overcomplicate things. But I know there are many legends and culture, and I get the idea of not just worship, because worship even has a funny.
It's really reverence.
Yeah, reverence. I think having reverence for whether it's Mauna Kea, whether it's certain plants or animals
Or each other.
that is not the same thing. And I think people can get caught up in this sense or idea of spirituality in such a way that they can strip away the humanity of that reverence.
Yes.
And why that's
and the
why
spirituality of it.
Well, yeah, because if you make it sound like it's that we don't have a say almost, and we do have a say in how we carry ourselves, and we don't have much of a say over much else, but that's something we do have. All right. So first off, what brings you to town?
Well, I came again to the United Nations because there are some opportunities. Every time there's an opportunity to come and speak and to participate in something at the United Nations is going on there, then I come. But I also use the opportunity to speak on the margins, to talk to ambassadors and other representatives and officials of the United Nations to promote and to remind them about our situation.
I like that,
because out of sight, out of mind, out of
the
sight.
reminding thing is important, because the history of the Hawaiian Kingdom was very well established within the international community prior to the illegal occupation
Yes,
of the
in
United
fact,
States.
the more and more we do a research, the more we find. We used to think that we had diplomatic legations, embassies, and consulates over. We would say over 90. Well, we recently found out there were 132.
Wow,
we have a specific number now, 132,
and that is
all over the
in
world.
direct comparison to any other nation's
right,
numbers.
even the U.S. I think what we're now researching to see how many other countries had that many.
Yeah.
And I think I would say very few.
Yeah, that's amazing. And by any account of, and I know that it's always tough because we do play into a little bit of the European interpretation of what is civility and civilization and sophistication. But by any measure, the Hawaiian Kingdom in the 19th century was on par with anybody else's development in everything from education, literacy, architecture. I mean, even your governmental structure. You guys mirrored a little bit of the UK. I mean, but not as it got down to the grassroots
it's interesting
people.
because we took what we saw in Western culture that was usable, and then we took and we adapted it for ourselves.
But not in whole cloth. I mean,
not the whole thing.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we improved on it. Or we said, well, if this is the principle of nationhood, then our nation is going to be one that's very much how our worldview fits into it, which is we have this lokahi, this God is first, and man and our environment. They all play the same role. A symbiotic role.
Right.
And so, so that's how our government is structured. So it becomes a government structured not on advancing economics and things like that, but it comes on how do we maintain this balance in
it's
the
not.
way
It's
we
not
create
unlike our culture that when we talk about things like 7 generations, we know that we have an obligation to those faces we will never see.
Right.
So when we talk about the power of creation, we talk about the evidence of creation, and then the things that we need to do to make sure that not just future generations of man, but future generations of creation, so whether it's animals or whatever else, that we do no harm.
Right.
And so that I think that fits in with that same
exactly.
idea of
and so our kings and queens, although they looked like royalty in a European form, actually had this mentality that it's their responsibility to carry this on for future generations. So their actions were based not on greed and or how much
power
they can
and
amass,
prestige,
but on what's going to benefit our people in the long run. And that's why they each one of them left a legacy of their own estates as a beneficial entity for our people. So Kamehameha Schools, was from
that's an example, sure.
Yeah,
named after essentially the first.
It was started by one of the descendants or the granddaughter of King Kamehameha, who happened to inherit all the lands, or it kind of funneled down to her a lot of the lands, and so she put it into a trust for education, and it's the largest educational trust in the world. Worth something like 11 to 14 billion.
One of the things that struck me, I remember a few years ago, there was a big controversy because at the graduation ceremony, there were, I think, a dozen students who wouldn't stand for the playing of the national anthem.
Yes,
and it turned into a major controversy. And there was, there were school administrators at the Kamehameha School who said they need to be punished.
Yeah,
and there was a flashback of it. And so the whole idea that no, they have a right not to stand, and that the school has lost its mission because it was interesting.
So Colin Kaepernick has nothing.
No, he came after that.
We had kids doing that. But it wasn't done out of a sense.
No, they weren't making. They weren't disrupting. They were just saying, this is taking who we are, right? They just.
And actually, so the year after, or a couple of years later, that same presentation it wasn't the graduation, but it was a formal concert presentation that they have every year, which is a huge production. It was full-on sovereignty. It was waving the Hawaiian flag and talking about our sovereign nation. Wow. So this kind of demonstration of who we are is now full blown. And we're not ashamed of who we are, in fact, and not necessarily proud from the standpoint of a Western idea of pride. But we're just saying this is who we are, and we accept who we are.
Sometimes we embrace the idea of pride. Sometimes make it sounds like the 7 deadly sins kind of thing. That pride sometimes can make you feel like it's a superiority thing.
Right.
I mean, from a Native person to say that I'm proud of who I am, it doesn't mean that I think that I'm superior to other people.
Right.
It means that I'm proud of that legacy that that brings me to where we're at. So I think pride is something, because everyone says, well, how come you can have Native pride, but white pride is such a terrible thing? Well, because when we use it, we're not talking about supremacy. Hey, look, it's the top of the hour, so we're gonna take a break. We're gonna go out on a song. We come back. I want to talk about Mauna Kea, a little bit of the FedRec stuff, and then we're gonna go to calls. So we're not gonna go to calls right after the top of the hour, but because I got more I want to cover with Leon here. But then we'll get to your calls. So this is John Kane with Leon Sue, the Foreign Affairs Minister of the Hawaiian Kingdom. We'll be right back after this. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. I got Leon Sue, who is the Foreign Affairs Minister for the Hawaiian Kingdom, in studio. Apologize, we're trying to sort out some things. We've got some other people coming and going. In fact, one of Leon's friends is probably going to sit in with us for a little bit here. But again, it's a great song to listen to. it's the Sorry Enough by Murray Porter. It's a song that I use for my cart, basically, for the film I'm showing tonight, Indian Horse. So by all means, if you have an opportunity to join us tonight, we'll be showing the film. I say we're starting at 7, but usually there's still people straggling in. So somewhere around between 7 and 7:30, we'll start the film. I think that you're going to learn some things you hadn't learned before. And although this is a dramatization, it's based on so many accounts that have taken place in on what were called Indian residential or boarding schools on the U.S. and on the Canadian side. The role the churches have played, the role the governments have played, and the exploitation of kids. It's a great, powerful film. So come out and join us. And of course, that's what Murray Porter's song is about. Canada actually doing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, coming up with a determination that yes, residential schools did constitute genocide, although in some of the language they use words like cultural genocide, which I think is kind of sad, because you don't need to put a precursor in front of the word genocide. It was genocide flat out. That's what it was. Now, the other thing that on the Canadian side, they actually did some, are you familiar? They actually did reparations, Reggie.
Did they?
Yeah, they actually pay. And I'm not saying that it solves the problem, but they actually did some cash payouts to people who were survivors of residential schools.
Really?
Yeah. So, I mean, the problem is, if you think money fixes the problem,
No.
it's kind of like affirmative action, right?
Right.
Look at how many people will criticize and say that affirmative action is racist, even though for all of the affirmative action programs that have existed in the United States, they still have not managed to balance the scales. Not even close. Not even close.
No.
So I don't know. It's one of those frustrating things. All right. Again, my guest is Leon Sue from Hawaii. Although you're on the road so much, how often do you get home?
Well, I get home maybe 3 or 4 weeks.
Okay. All right.
For a couple of weeks, and then I'm off again.
All right. 'Cause I know that you're traveling a lot. I see you. I see you on Twitter and Facebook and stuff like that. So I know that I know you stay busy. But you think, and we can talk about the tide turning, but specifically, because I want to narrow this down into compartments here on the recognition, and I don't know, I'm not even sure what the right words are, because I've used words like restoration, but if you're taking the position that the Hawaiian Kingdom does exist and always has existed, then restoration isn't really the case. It's the wrong term.
Yeah, right.
But if you're saying, no, we are fighting for acknowledgement and recognition for those who are unfamiliar, I don't know what the right terminology is.
We're still kind of battling with that.
Okay.
I mean, because we don't quite know either. We just know that we always have been, we are and always have been. And so whatever we can use to get people's attention to it is fine. If they want to use the word restoration, that's fine. But we have to be clear ourselves.
Right.
So we've gone back and forth. Are we occupied or are we colonized, and all these kinds of stuff? And we're neither. We actually are just there. We're who we are. But for the sake of argument and for the sake of understanding of other people, we tend to use their terms.
Well, and I guess as you travel and you speak to ambassadors from other countries, I mean, I got to think that a lot of these countries still have nothing that formally ends their diplomatic relationship with the Hawaiian Kingdom.
Correct.
Some may have.
Correct.
But I got to think the vast majority just kind of shied away as the United States
sort of
imposed
just
its will.
hanging there. And in fact, those that have been asked about whether or not our treaties are still in effect will refuse to really answer.
Yeah.
Or let's say they dodge the question.
Well, and I think from diplomatically, they're probably not sure what the right answer is, because they're obviously there's repercussions to that.
Yes.
If they say, and I know you guys could kind of squeeze them a little bit, because if they say something if they say the right answer, then there's obviously the next question. So it's never just do you still recognize the Hawaiian Kingdom, or is there a date that you stopped? Because that's tough. I mean, even for the United States, and I know when they were first doing these FedRec hearings during the Obama administration.
Yes.
One of the things
prior, it was during the Bush administration.
Right.
Too.
Well, sure. You're right. But part of what the issue was the rejection of the Interior Department as opposed to the State Department.
Oh, yes.
Playing and in fact John Kerry was pressed. A formal letter was sent from OHA,
Office
right?
of Hawaiian Affairs,
which caused all kinds of problems even within that structure because
Correct.
that is a kind of that has become a bit of a submissive office.
Right.
But that act was pretty significant at the time.
That's right. Well, it was by the at the time the executive director who was basically asking, "Can you let us know whether or not we're violating international law by performing our duties under this structure? And are we or are we still not part of the? Is the Hawaiian Kingdom still not a sovereign nation?" And so he's asking John Kerry to respond to that. And of course, the trustees of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs all freaked out. And they insisted he withdraw the letter and try to reprimand him.
Put smoke back in the bottle.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. But what they did is, of course, they got Kerry off the hook from responding to it. So nobody responded to it. So sort of no harm done. But you're right.
But it started a movement.
Yeah.
I mean, because I know
what
the
movement was already going. What it did was it opened
fired it
up
yeah.
the bottle. Yeah.
Well, because during the Obama administration, when he was sending Sally Jewell and company out to Hawaii to try to sell this idea of creating a streamlined process to issue federal recognition to Hawaiians
to a native Hawaiian
as an Indian tribe, essentially, for all intents and purposes.
Yes.
Even though they tried to hedge their language, but that's essentially what they're doing.
Right.
And they used arguments like, well, we think that some of the things that we're doing are unconstitutional unless you're an Indian tribe, because they still couldn't get out of the mindset that where you fit within U.S. citizenry. And so the whole idea that they could say, well, the only exception we have to having certain dollars set aside for a specific group of people like this would be if you were federally recognized. So they pitched this whole idea.
Right.
And they went from island to island. I think there was over 15 hearings.
Public hearings.
And the overwhelming majority, and I watched almost all of them because many of them were taped. The overwhelming majority of the people who went there told the Interior Department, basically had the Interior Department so intimidated that they started bringing in Bureau of Land Management police to protect them. They felt like their lives were in danger.
And then they decided to turn to America and have hearings here among the Indian tribes here.
Yeah, and they were doing for what they were calling the civic organization, and they held them on federally recognized casinos and stuff like that.
And they got the same thing. I mean, and basically, thank God that the Indian nations here said, that's not our business.
Yeah. But then, so the overwhelming response from these things were against this idea of federal recognition, against this Interior Department trying to put them into this tribal box, and yet the powers that be, both within the Obama administration and some of the what I call the Fed wreckers, they started doing these mass emailings.
Yes. And
the Obama administration literally dismissed the human petition, the actual physical presentation of all these people showing at these hearings, and said based solely on these robotic, automated, emails saying, the overwhelming majority of Hawaiians want federal recognition, and they dismissed all of the people who sometimes had to drive miles to go to these places and take time out of their day, and instead they said, well, we're relying almost solely on those emails. I mean, it is. Yeah, it's amazing to me when I listen to some of this.
Yes, but it was so obvious that nobody took it seriously. So they did pass a rule to say yes, they could streamline the nation, but it was still up to put together some form of a nation in Hawaii. And so that was a whole nother fiasco.
Yeah, I know.
When they tried to get a vote going, and everybody was saying, "Wait a minute, nobody signed up to vote." And so then they say, well, we have a list here that we have from before of 130,000 Hawaiians that could qualify to vote. So let's have an election.
So they started registering people who didn't even register, essentially, for all intents and purposes.
And then so they try to have this election, and there's a lawsuit filed against it. It goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court and says you cannot have an election based on racial qualifications, period. And so they decide to chuck the election and just say anybody who wants to serve as a delegate to come to this constitutional convention can come. And so they had 100 and so many people on this delegates list. They meet for a week. They come up with this atrocious document of creating a new constitution for the Hawaiian nation that nobody wants.
Or whatever they want to call it.
Tribal nation, all that nobody wants. And then they announced success, and then they're supposed to go into getting it ratified. They can't raise the money to get the ratified. So
and to be clear, just like within many native territories here, we have people who are totally bought into some of these systems, and you have some folks back home that they know there's money involved. And you got to think that some of these people think that I guess. With good intentions, think it's the best we're ever going to get. So this is what we should settle for.
And that's really what it is.
But then you have a whole lot of people who just know that there's money to be made.
Yeah,
there's contracts.
There's a
funding.
few of those, but and they are dangerous because of the incentive that they have.
Right.
But most of the people who support federal recognition are basically saying, "Let's get the best we can do."
They don't have confidence in
that we'll ever succeed.
Yeah, and that's probably, and of course I think that's what a lot of Native people have experienced on the continent.
So to me, those are people sitting on the fence because once we start to succeed, they will then jump in. Because that's all they're waiting for.
Let's talk about the idea that, I think Mauna Kea is a perfect example of what many people thought was an insurmountable battle. Mm-hmm. I think many people, including many Hawaiian people who were in the fight, knew that it was against all odds to stop this huge multi-billion-dollar project from occurring on what is regarded as a very sacred site, one that has already been somewhat desecrated with what are 13 other telescopes, but none at the scale of this thing. So I think many people who were involved in that fight, and I think part of the fact that so many people thought it wasn't an insurmountable fight didn't join on until more recently. In fact, there was even some separation. I used to try to talk to some of the Mauna Kea people about Hawaiian Kingdom and about federal. No, I don't even want to talk about that. They were so afraid to lose any focus on Mauna Kea. Yeah. But honestly, when those things started coming together is when the Mauna Kea fight became stronger.
Yes, but I think that the strategy worked because they really focused on the problem or on the challenge at hand, which is Mauna Kea, and stopping the construction of the TMT telescope, the 30-meter telescope. But as you said, once the people saw that they could work together on one focus and succeed with that, then the idea becomes, hey, wait a minute, we are a nation. We are actually functioning as a nation. And so now we're at the point where everyone is saying, okay, we've done this, what's next?
I mean, you had to change politicians. You had to change politicians, everybody from the senators, the congressmen, the local
mayors.
I mean, there were so many people that were already signed on to this idea.
Right.
And you've slowly, inch by inch, taken people and changed. And it looks like the tide is pretty well turned. I'm not saying it's the 30-meter telescope is dead, but they're clearly looking for other sites and saying, nah, this isn't right.
Yeah, for all intents and purposes, it's going to move somewhere else.
Yeah, and I look forward to the day that we all officially declare victory. But I think many of us are feeling pretty good about that situation. And that should be an indication about the power of the Hawaiian people. And and I think any of those who are somewhat, I guess, apprehensive about the kingdom and about true sovereignty should revisit this fight and say, look, this kind of proves that we have something that we can build upon, and that goes beyond just protecting a mountain, goes to protecting it all.
And it wasn't just the sheer power. I think the way that it was done, the term kapu aloha, which means a sacred aloha. Well, that has become the focal point as well. If we can do this with the mauna, with the mountain, then we can do this with our nation. Kapu aloha. We can solve our problems. We can overcome the obstacles by showing aloha and relying on this, nonviolent and positive showing of love for one another, which is would seem to be the most inefficient and ineffective way of doing something, but it works.
Well, efficiency is one of those things, oftentimes even that gets measured in dollars and cents and not in any real practical way of measuring. And of course, the battle to protect Mauna Kea, has overlapped with, some of the folks from Standing Rock and Water is Life from protecting.
Yes.
So a lot of these environmental movements have become connected. And, so whether you talk about Greta Thunberg, or Amber Peltier, the young Native woman, or some of the, many of the powerful voices. And I say powerful voices because there's been some great folks. I mean, going back decades in Hawaii that have views poetry and song and speech, and even going back to Israel was I think sometimes people downplay the significance that he played in activism, and that's absolutely what he was about.
Right.
And Songs of Sovereignty is almost essentially, has a foundation from guys like Israel.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So, we're really, I was happy. We're really encouraged by what's going on. We're moving in the right direction, in the proper spirit. And we believe that this can go all the way. In other words, we can regain our independence that way, and be recognized in the world. Now, so my job is to try to prepare the world to embrace this idea of Hawaii becoming once again a member of the family of nations. And so I've been trying to prepare the way, and we found that there are people willing to hear our story and are very, very sympathetic with our story.
What nations do you think have been, at this point, to you, been the most receptive to?
Well, those that have struggled to become independent themselves.
Sure, okay.
Which, when the UN started out in 1940, 75 years ago, 45 or so.
They had a whole decolonization movement.
Well, there were two main purposes for the UN that were stated. One was to settle disputes through peaceful means. The second was to decolonize the world.
Yeah.
So what they did set about very assiduously to decolonize the world. And so when they started with 51 nations, today there are 193 nations. So in many ways, that the decolonization focus has succeeded, even though maybe only about 100 were decolonized per se. The rest had to fight bloody wars of liberation.
Yeah.
And
of course, there's always going to be legacies of colonization that remain.
Well, not always. I'm hopeful that.
Well, no, it doesn't always have to be. But
we
I'm
will
saying
eradicate it after a while. But that is what is still the underpinning of much of how the world functions, is colonized mindset. So we have in the United Nations a very, very receptive audience to liberation, to freedom, and to decolonization, to self-determination. These are all terms that most of the countries now in the United Nations understands. The few older countries and those that have themselves become colonial countries are still, trying to stave that off. So ironic thing is that the United Nations General Assembly 30 years ago declared the first decade for the eradication of all forms of
racial discrimination,
of colonialization, all forms of colonialism. And so then 10 years went by, and so they declared a second decade. 10 years went by, they declared a third decade. We're in the last year of the third decade of this supposed focus on decolonizing the world, and nothing really has happened in the 30 years. Everything has actually atrophied
Yeah.
some 30 years
Well,
ago.
and there's some places you can argue have lost ground. I mean, I see what's happening in Bolivia and even Venezuela. Regardless of where people stand on, Evo Morales or Nicolas Maduro, clearly some of the influences of a huge colonial power like the United States has influence on these coups that are occurring, throughout the world.
Yes, yeah.
And so
So the world is far from...
we have to be vigilant.
Right,
is
the world
point.
is far from decolonized. And then there's the whole new colonizer, not new, but the real colonizer, which is the economic system.
Yeah, capitalism. Yeah.
Capitalism, yeah.
Sure.
Or let's say a runaway form of capitalism.
Yeah.
Because there are some good points of capitalism.
Sure,
But this is, this is outrageous.
But when you create an aristocracy based on wealth, not on
Yes.
on monarchy,
Yes.
oligarchy, essentially,
and
then
when
it's
you
still a
can
problem.
overpower nations through corporations,
Yeah.
then it's a real problem.
Yeah.
And that's
One last thing before we take a break, and then I go to calls. I got to ask you because I know, once again, Hawaii gets put in the crosshairs militarily as the potential one of the bases for Trump's new Star Force.
Yes.
What is it? Space Force?
Yes.
Space Force.
So
Space Force.
As absurd as that even sounds to many of us, you do have to take some of this stuff seriously.
Yes.
Because obviously, the two things that the Hawaiian people are the most victimized by is tourism, and again that runaway capitalism, and the militarism that has dominated and in fact invited essentially a world war.
Yeah, it's drawn the big red X on our country. For any enemy of the United States, will have to take us out first.
Yeah, I go back to that false flag or that missile warning that came out. It wasn't a false flag, but it was a. You guys have to take that seriously because you are the most. You obviously, there's a strong military presence there that makes you a target already, and you are the farthest away from really being able to be quote unquote protected. You actually are placed more in jeopardy because of it. So,
yeah.
All right. So, but again, this is something that you guys are obviously. Has this entered into any conversations that
very
you've
much
had?
so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
I gotta believe so. All right, we'll take a break. We're at the bottom of the hour. We'll take a break and we'll come back. We are going to go to your calls. So go to 212-209-2877. That's the number to call. You can talk to myself and Leon, ask some questions. I'm sure that there are many of you that have questions about a lot of what we've talked about. Again, 212-209-2877. That's the number, and we'll take your calls when we come back and round out the show. This is John Kane. Leon Sue, this is Let's Talk. Coming back, this is John Kane. This is Let's Talk. I've got my friend Leon Sue, who is the Foreign Affairs Minister for the Hawaiian Kingdom, in studio. We've run into each other multiple times. We've I've come to a couple of events, and you've been a guest on my show at least 3 or 4 times, I believe. And it's always a pleasure to have you join me to update me on not only your work but even just what's happening in Hawaii in general. And we've covered so much. So I wanted to give callers an opportunity to ask us some questions, to maybe add their thoughts on some of this stuff. So we'll get right into it. We'll go to caller. Caller, you're up first. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Oh, hi. Great show. Great guest. And I always like to stay anonymous, if that's okay.
That's fine. You can give me. You just turned into Bob. No, go ahead. Just whatever.
Call me, John Doe. But
all right.
Okay. First thing, is it possible that, are you talking about Hawaii? And there was a couple points I wanted to make questions, but you're saying that Hawaii should secede from the 50 states and declare itself independent? Is that the
that's
goal,
not the term, but that's the result. Yes, Hawaii was never actually inducted into the United States
legally.
So it'd be like if you can't get a divorce unless you're married first. So we're not looking at succeeding. We're looking at reinstating our country as a sovereign nation as it was before.
Ironically, in 1993, the United States literally, through a joint resolution of Congress, apologized for what they did to Hawaii. And what makes it even more ironic is that through a joint resolution of Congress, they issued this apology, what they call this apology resolution, where they acknowledge what they did was illegal, but they don't fix it. And then when there was any effort by some of the activist community in Hawaii to use that resolution, the Supreme Court turns around and says, "Oh, a joint resolution of Congress has no legal merit."
Right.
What makes that so ironic is the way that the United States claims that they took Hawaii in was through a joint resolution of Congress,
Yes.
which was illegal. It's not the mechanism. It is not the annexation mechanism. The way the United States gains territory is that a country or a nation would request annexation, would submit an annexation treaty to the President of the United States. The United States would approve it and then seek 2/3 majority approval of the U.S. Senate to make that annexation true. The president at the time, Grover Cleveland, said, "Nah. This isn't even a legal treaty." So he rejected the treaty out of hand. So it never went before the Senate, but rather his successor decided, well, we're not going to use the constitutional mechanism for annexation. We're just going to pass through a joint resolution of Congress, where many of the congressmen said, we're just doing something illegal. A congressman from Texas in particular weighed in and said, we're just trying to create a legal theft here. And so that is the basis for which the United States claims to have occupied Hawaii in the first place. So I hope this gives some clarity, because I know your question, seems like an extreme proposition. But when you understand the truth behind how Hawaii came to be illegally occupied and be an occupied territory, let alone become a state, is all been based on illegal activity.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Now, isn't this ironic that President Obama claimed or is allegedly born in Hawaii, but if Hawaii is not legitimate, then there is legitimacy almost to the fact that if he was born in 1961, Hawaii became a state in 1959. Didn't it take 5 years for them? Maybe that's why they didn't have the birth certificate, but we won't get into that. One question I wanted to ask you about Native Americans and Hawaii especially. Is there any activity, I know this is a little controversial, is there any activity with UFOs, aliens? A lot of Native Americans said about ant people. How did the Dogon tribe know there was a Sirius B when we didn't even know this through modern astronomy until 1900s? And
I got to tell you that's not an area that I have any real working knowledge of. I do know that there are native peoples who have different creation stories, including the Kiowa, who believe they came from that their creation story involves being ants. Although the Kiowa I know was a 350-pounder, he looked anything but like an ant. But we went to different colleges together. But no, I got to tell you, as far as the UFO and the alien stuff, that's not an area that I have any place to speak. I don't know if you.
Nor I.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So, but
okay, last question. Even if you are a president and it seems like you're going to change, how many people do you think Barack Obama had to execute, murder? Is it in the thousands? But those are bad people. Those are people who are our enemies. So we'll kill, rob, steal, do whatever. Like the president said, hey, if it's in the interest, well, why don't we do it? It's for the betterment of the people. This is the Orwellian newspeak that we're constantly being fed. We murder people. We've done so much destruction. What is our karma going to be? The Native Americans talk about a fifth something that's going to happen, and all the signs are happening that we are on real serious precipices of destruction.
Well, empires don't last forever, and especially if you are an aggressive empire. I mean, there's always going to be cracks that show up, and when you look at the U.S. system of governance, and you're right. I mean, Noam Chomsky suggested that every president since World War II, and I don't know why he would not include the ones from World War II, could have and should have been convicted of war crimes, including Obama. Obama, killed and not just people who were in the U.S. national interest. There were many innocent people who were killed with. I mean, he was king of the drone strike, and so there are many people who have been killed at the hands of U.S. militarism, and who knows the stuff that we don't know, right? But no, I'm not necessarily a believer in karma, but that doesn't mean that this stuff doesn't create a tension that could undermine not only a nation's legitimacy, but I mean, you listen to even some of this impeachment stuff. I mean, you hear Democrats completely contradicting the view that they took when Clinton was being impeached, and you have Republicans completely contradicting, including Dershowitz, who now all of a sudden says, "Oh, I studied and found out everything that I said, back during Clinton administration was wrong, and now I've got this position because I've learned more." I mean, come on, give me a break. The hypocrisy is incredible. But the thing is, though, and you kind of touched a little bit, is the consistency that comes from people like Leon Siu and the Hawaiian people and that come from Native people. We oftentimes, even in spite of the incredible pressures tied to assimilation, there are still voices that come out of our communities that are as consistent today as they were 7 generations ago. Mm-hmm. So thank you. I thank you very much for the call.
Thank you. I wanted to mention something about what he said about Obama and his citizenship.
Oh, his birth certificate stuff, yeah.
Yes, yes, technically, because Hawaii was still and continues to be a sovereign nation, it really was not the United States. So he actually was not born in the United States. And so therefore there is a question about his citizenship.
Well, and as there was with McCain and others along the, I mean, didn't even Romney have some questions about citizenship?
Yeah, there was a question. Yeah, because I think his
Mexico.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of
and McCain. And let's not forget, McCain was born in Panama.
Right.
He was born in Panama.
Yeah. So I mean,
military base.
I don't know. There's a whole bunch of contradictions. And again, historically, you will always find where people have managed to create exceptions to rules, and especially when they play in somebody's favor. All right, let me go to another caller. Mm-hmm. Caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Yeah, hi, John. Good afternoon. This is Arnold from Peekskill.
Hey, Arnold, how are you doing?
Good. I want to ask the foreign minister.
Yes.
Yeah. What's the situation? By the way, congratulations on Mauna Kea.
Thank you very much.
As well, what's the situation in regard to the environment around Pearl Harbor?
You mean the actual environmental conditions of Pearl Harbor?
Yes.
A disaster. However, because, again, of the U.S. Clean Air, Clean Water Act and things like that, there have been remedial things done. And I'd like to report that earlier, a few months ago, they actually started releasing the oysters back into Pearl Harbor to help clean them up, taking their lead from the Hudson River, and so that's underway, and there's a real definite move to try to clean things up. However, again, as a military base and having decades or actually a century of military use, there's a lot of cleanup to do.
Well, and it goes beyond just cleaning up. I mean, obviously, you also have bombing ranges and island areas that have been, but you also have just the military activity is so disruptive to the ecology, especially the aquatic ecology.
Right. And then
it's really
that whole Pacific area that's used for training of naval,
exercises, they say, yeah.
Right. Okay. So, but Pearl Harbor itself, I would say, is better now than it was 20 years ago, and they're really making a concerted effort to bring it back. And
and also another thing in regard to there's a community of people from the Marshall Islands. What's your relationship with them? The Marshallese who live in Hawaii.
Yeah, I have a very good relationship with them. In fact, the reason I'm more active here in New York and with the UN, all that, was because of the Minister of Foreign Affairs from the Marshall Islands about 20 years ago. Just really gave us a lot of encouragement and opened some doors for us to enter into the international arena. So we're very close to the Marshall Islands. They, of course, have a bunch of issues that are very, very trying, particularly the effects of the nuclear radiation.
Yeah.
And Hawaii is the first place where they come to for, of course, medical treatment and for economic reasons, because they're having a hard time in the Marshall Islands.
Now, the Marshall Islands are a little bit more susceptible also to the rising sea levels,
Yes,
because they
yes.
don't come out of the water as
Right.
high as much as
That's
places like
correct.
Hawaii does.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Like Marjoro, the capital island is 3 feet above
Wow.
sea level.
Wow.
You know, well, the highest point is less than 2 meters.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and well, thanks for that call. I mean, no, environmentally, I mean, this actually makes, gives you even more of an argument to what your responsibility has to be to reclaim your sovereignty and that kind of stuff, because frankly, the United States has been a very, very poor steward of the land that they have laid claim to. So I think it makes a solid argument. All right, let's go to another call. Caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
My name is Mitch. I'm calling from Brooklyn.
Hey, Mitch. Thanks for calling.
All right. I was told that there was a contingency of Native Indians fighting on the side of the Civil War for the Confederacy. Are you familiar with that? And also the Native Americans' involvement with enslavement of black people during that period.
I'm not familiar. I couldn't just flat out tell you which quote unquote tribes fought on the side of the Confederacy, but a whole lot of Americans did too, by the way. But no, there were Native people who were involved in the slave trade. They had become very much assimilated. The Cherokee themselves had. It's ironic because Native people had been enslaved from the beginning of the slave trade all the way through. I talk about the gold rush era. Native people were still being enslaved in California, even in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, right up through. So arguably, some would say through residential schools that these children were still being enslaved because they were being sent into the fields to work and that kind of stuff. So Native people, by and large, were more victims of slavery than perpetrators of slavery. But there were examples of Native communities that had followed basically the lead of white people, and in fact bought slaves from them, and so they had participated. Part of what happened with the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears was they made a conscious effort to free the slaves that were among them, and frankly, that turned into a controversy that raged even through fairly modern times, when these slaves that were called the freedmen, some of the whiter Cherokees decided that there was time to remove some of them from their enrollment. It ended up being in a court battle, and the freedmen won. So their citizenship, and I hate to even use that word because they don't. They're all still take pride in American citizenship, but their enrollment, to put it that way, was upheld by the court. So it ends up getting mired in the same kind of conversation that, Leon, you and I have about where do we fit in as a distinct people that where U.S. citizenship it comes in. In fact, it makes me want to ask you another question. I saw in one of your pictures your Hawaiian passport.
Yes.
The Haudenosaunee, we have been fighting with the international community quite a bit over our passports, and it's a fight that we have won, lost, and right now I don't think we're really on the successful side of it. In fact, I spoke at the UN a couple of years ago about this issue. What's the status of you getting not just the United States but other countries to recognize the Hawaiian passport?
Well, it's actually since 9/11 in particular that things got complicated.
Yeah. The Homeland Security, the Western Hemisphere, and the Travel Initiative, and all that stuff.
Globally, the whole. What do you call them? The security measures went up, skyrocketed.
Well, but even the battle between electronic passports. I mean, because many countries still wanted to rely. They didn't think paper passports represented the security threat. In fact, they thought electronic passports may be more hackable. So that has even turned into an international debate.
Yes, it has. But electronic is where everyone is going. The airports are geared for that. Yeah. So if you try to travel with a paper passport without all of the electronic security measures built in, then you've got a long wait at each port that you're at.
Sometimes that wait's worth it, I'll add.
Well, sometimes, But, you have to sit there and talk to and work your way up the system.
Sure.
So that's been a hindrance to us actually using our passports. I can still use it in some places that still honor our passports.
See, I always thought that one of the negotiations that could take place between Native people and the U.S. State Department was, I wouldn't have a problem with compromising and using a U.S. passport as long as they could create language that allowed me as a Native person not to necessarily have to declare U.S. citizenship. That's the problem.
And actually, there is a category that you can do it.
I know, the Samoan. The Samoa.
Well, not just Samoa, but let's see, there are other peoples who live in the United States for various reasons, refugees, for instance, and people seeking asylum who can get an American passport
as a national,
of their own country.
But they have not been willing to have that conversation with us, right?
Right. So we need to push that. In fact, see, we're working on a number of different things. We're looking to, first of all, get our own passports validated,
and that's a great place to end up. But as a stopgap measure, the idea of utilizing the existing infrastructure of the United States, it's belligerence on their part not to want to work with us.
Yes. Yeah, so in the interim, we do need to have the United States allow for the designation of our citizenship to be proper.
Right.
Yeah.
And to recognize it, yeah. So, all right, let me go. Let's go to another call. Maybe we'll try to get two more in before we got to get out of here. What, about 5 till? So, let's see what we can do. We got another caller on the line. Caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hi there. Thank you for taking the call. L from Long Island.
L, thanks for calling.
Okay, I'm wondering if you or your guest, if you guys are familiar with Dr. David M. Hotep and his work and research in ancient history of the America. Also, I'd like to know, maybe I should ask the question, either written records or pictures, any type of historical evidence that would place the, quote, native people referred to as Indians here on some timeline, years. In other words, we hear that the indigenous people of this country has been here and are the first, and each nation had its own name. And I'm just wondering, from historical records from any source, has anyone other than the Dr. David Imhotep been able to put a time?
Well, there's been a lot of study, especially for indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere. There's been a lot of debunking windows that people have tried to create in terms of when people lived here. And there's a guy, and I can't think of his last name, but his name was Graham, and I can't think of his last name, but he's been doing. I think he's from the UK. He is an anthropologist, and many others have pretty well asserted and produced documentation and evidence that there has been a human presence in the Western Hemisphere not 30,000 years ago, but 130,000 years ago. And he suggests that there's essentially 100,000 years of human existence that is not only been ignored, but is relatively unknown of. So, a lot of this stuff, like the land bridges, and I'm one of these folks who believe that the populations that would ultimately make up the indigenous populations of North and South America came not from one source. I mean, there's a lot of people want to come up with this one source idea that land bridge, or navigated across the north, or navigated across the south, or from Africa, or from Polynesia. And I think that there's pretty good evidence that the nomadic or the voyager gene within humankind has placed people here from a variety of different places. I don't subscribe to the one source origin stories that many people do. But I think there's pretty good evidence, and a lot of this has come to light every time somebody says, well, we think the window was 3,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago. We're at a place now where it's becoming more and more widely accepted that there have been people on in North and more in particular in South America as far back as 130,000 years ago, and so there is good evidence. Now, Hawaii is another situation. The Polynesian voyagers that would ultimately settle Hawaii. Is there as much a question mark as to, I know people get caught up in dates and time. Is it pretty well established when Hawaii was occupied?
Yes. As far as what we know of the modern Hawaiians and Polynesians, we actually, of course, there are the legends of the continent of Mu and others, and so we don't really know how far back that goes. But as far as the modern Polynesians coming to the Hawaiian Islands, that's just a few thousand years ago when we came to the islands. But as far as our ancestry, that of course goes back thousands of years and actually traces back in through the Proto-Polynesian cultures all the way back to India and then further back into the Middle East.
Sure.
So, and we have our legends and our genealogies that tell us that.
Because because I know the idea, that volcanic islands, became so life supporting. I mean, even that is that probably is not done all by itself either. Nature has its role, but I think human settlement and Polynesian settlement had a lot to do with even developing part of the ecosystems.
We have a term called canoe plants. And that is the plants that were brought by the settlers.
There you go. There you go.
That we flourished all over the islands.
Yeah, we can do. We'll try to squeeze one more call in before I start running over driving forces afterwards. So let's go, caller. You're up next. You're up last. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hey, John. This is Joe from New Jersey. How are you?
Good. How you doing?
All right, not bad. We all know that the land was stolen originally from Lucy, the missing link's Monkey's uncle. Before you guys even got here, Lucy's missing link, Monkey's uncle owned the land, and you guys took it from them. You know what I mean?
You know that? All right, yeah. All right. Well, I hate to go out on such a crazy call, but there we go. Oh man,
you're welcome, John.
You wanted me to take that last call, didn't you? All right, I'll be a monkey's uncle. Well, we warned you about calls like this, right? Right. Well, I gotta tell you, I want to thank you as always. Anytime you're in town, and I appreciate you reaching out to me, letting me know you're going to be around.
And thank you so much for keeping our issue up forward.
Because even when you're not here, I talk about you.
Yes, I know.
There's almost no way that I can talk about any of the native genocide, the doctrine of discovery, all that stuff without taking it to the next step and seeing when I talk about when does the American genocide end, which I talked about before you got made it in the studio. This is as much a challenge today because what you're battling against is this effort to disappear you, and that's and that's what FedRec is. That's what a lot of this stuff is. So I can't talk about that without bringing you guys up, and I never will. So again, thanks so much for being a part of the show. I want to thank you guys for listening. Hey, next week I believe we're going to introduce my new co-host. I think Regan will be joining us. We'll see how that goes. I think that's going to happen. I want to remind people in just a couple of hours, if you come down to the Brooklyn Commons, we're gonna screen Indian Horse, which is a great film laying out a little much of what examples of what took place at residential schools. So come join us. We'll have the film and we'll have a discussion afterwards. Look forward to seeing you. And of course, come down, make a donation to WBAI. We'll put a basket out. You guys can donate to help pay our rent here, and I greatly appreciate it. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk. We'll see you next week. Yahweh.